Hello and welcome to another episode, and this time I want to talk about flashlight. And flashlight means of course that we have artificial light for our texture work. I think that's not the typical case, and it has some disadvantages, and of course sometimes we can't live with artificial light. And in the field we don't have the power to have studio lights, big halogen lights or something like that. So we have to talk a little bit about if we use it for fill or as the main light, full light, if we have a single source or several of these. And the first part is of course that we take a look to a point and shoot or a smaller DSLR, because the bigger ones have mostly no flashlight even in it, even if they are more expensive. So we have typically here a little lens, and we have here a tiny window where a light source is. That can be a xenon tube or just an LED. It flashes when we tell the camera to do so, or maybe the automatic gives it already away. Then there is sometimes here a little shoe on top of that where we can mount something else if maybe this option is not there or it is too weak. In medium class cameras there's a little pop out flash, and it has of course then also the limitation that it has to be inside of the camera. All these limitations behind, we can buy a special flashlight that is typically a box with a little window, xenon tube or whatever, and these days even LEDs in it. It might have even a sensor, and it has of course a shoe here, a hot shoe as the name is, and this hot shoe can have also a cable plug in it. This is available in a wide variety. It can be just a very, and excuse my language here, a stupid flash. That means it just flashes when it gets the order to do so, or it has, via these sensor, a connection to the camera and figure out what would be the right idea in terms of intensity, and then it flashes. And so it can be even far away from the camera with a cable or with an trigger in Wi-Fi, so to say, and we can have even many of them. And many of them brings us normally directly to the theme of a studio setup. And a studio setup would typically a softbox when we want to photograph textures, for example, because we try to avoid to have shadows in it. And these are normally boxes where we have the light here in the end and then a wide silky fabric in front, so the light, even if it is very sharp from a flashlight, because the light source is first very bright and secondly very small, that means we get normally a very harsh shadow, but with a silky screen in front of it, it gets diffused, and so we get a very nice soft light. These are typically on stands, and so they are higher and of course adjustable, and we can have them also as just boxes that sit on the floor, and we have maybe 2 or 3 in it if you like, so you can build them on your own. Also silk if we like, or not at all. Sometimes these boxes have even a raster like black fabric in front of it, so the light gets even directed. These are typically not used in a single version, mostly 2 or 3 or more. And last but not least, to make that a little bit more complete, we have here these discs, for example. That is just white fabric, silver or whatever. And white is the typical way because this bounces the light more diffuse. The silvery or golden one, they create something that we know more as caustics, and that's not preferable. The silver and the golden one, from my point of view, are only there to direct the light and then have another one in front of it and diffuse it then where it is needed. But I take this away, we stay here with the white, and I put an R in it so we know it's a reflector. So let's go over the downsides of these things here, and I want to go of course first to our little point and shoot, and this is maybe the camera that we have most of the time in the pocket, and we see a nice texture and we have maybe not the light. So the downside of this configuration is of course that the light source is very close to the axis, but it is not on the axis, so we get always a tiny little amount of shadow in it. If we had here a table that is directly on the wall and we had a sphere here, this would create here underneath on the side a little shadow. If we have a structure on it, we have tons of little shadows inside that as well. And then comes the solution number 2 into the game. We use this flash and we use maybe here this one with a little slave trigger. This is something that I have since decades and it works fantastically. Not that I'm a big fan of flashlight at all, but when it is needed, you have maybe no other option. And this takes the flashlight that is in the room, it needs to see it of course, and then it triggers the flash and gives the light as well. So we can mount this one here, for example, underneath, or we just hold it and then we fill light into this shadow. But the downside is of course we get a little shadow here, very tiny, and we have a little tiny shadow here. So we limit the amount of shadow in one place, but we add a tiny little one later on. I will show you that. Of course, we could bounce the shadow. There comes here this round thingy into the game. So if we go now here first to the bounce and then to the sphere, it's maybe already a little bit better because it bounces here all over the place and we get a lot of light. It loses the intensity, but we get a more diffuse light that I try to get always when I have a cloudy day or something like that. So this would be here the mini studio set up in a pocket, and then in a studio of course the use would be that we have maybe, when we look now from the object, that we have here another softbox with a light source in, or we use maybe something like an umbrella here, and I draw this very badly here now because I don't want to waste time, and we flash the light into the white umbrella and then it bounces back to the object, and the object would be in the front. And when we have this nicely arranged here, then one will eat up the shadow from the other one and we get a nearly shadowless light here, which is normally used when you have here one light underneath, two from the side, and sometimes there's a little space here at all between where the camera can look through and then the model also puts his face in, and it's washed nearly with light, with very soft light, and everything gets nicely even. These are the options that we could have, and even such a setup here is portable, but I think it's more for a studio. This here would be more with a reflector, and if you have two of these and you have an assistant who can hold these two reflectors, you might get away with this small setup here even. But finally, if you have only one camera with one flash, you run into a problem. And let's have a look to exactly the results of something like this. On the left and the right, two similar results, not very extremely apart from each other, but done with two different light settings, and the time between these images is not even a minute. And the left one is done with the diffuse daylight, and then I have put the aperture a little bit down, because with flash you can't go really down to 4000s or lower and have the flash and sync, especially when you have a slave flash on it. So I have blown out here the shadows but not the color of the surface, and as you can see the sky is a little bit darker here. Of course I could push the whole picture a little bit, so this color here would be more like this. This has a little bit more saturation, maybe based on the light that we had, but also this is done more in the shadows, so it has a little bit more bluish in it, and the more blue the light is, the less saturation we get, of course, with these tones here. Anyway, the idea was here to get two similar results and to show you the tiny little details. We can see here some light in it, here and maybe here and with the mouse. And you can see here where it gets darker, it's blown out from the flashlight. It's even brighter than the neighbors. And that is maybe a detail that I think is very important to understand, that it looks natural here because we are used to have these shadows, but in a moment I just illuminate these shadows away, I have to create them with a bump map. And when I do so, then, and I put here my little marks away, when I have a bump map here and I say the light comes from this and maybe a little bit behind the camera, then I get here, of course, some shadows in it that I need. And this puts then the whole picture inside of my scene immediately, because it is in sync with the light situation itself. And I get here a shadow, and I have here some shadows, and maybe here, and so on. I will not complete this and waste your time, but you get the idea. In the moment I have the sun not here, I have the sun here, I get different shadows here. And if the light source moves or the object moves, then it's very believable in the scene. Here I have already some shadows in the scene, and the more prominent these shadows would be, the less usable the texture is, of course. So filling the whole area, which is one theme here, is sometimes a good idea, but of course we have then to create a mask or an area that we can use for the bump map or for the displacement. Either way, these both are not far away from being usable, but both need maybe a little bit work to get rid of the shadow here a little bit, and maybe the colorization here, but this is of course up to you what was the right thing. Color, light temperature and everything else is of course a theme for a future episode of this series here. What I wanted to do is just to give you an idea that one object can look completely different just by having a little fill light from the camera. In these three examples I have used here on the left just the light that we had, and this is of course already light where I wouldn't think at all we need urgently a flashlight also. But if we had some stronger light here, then maybe that would be the case. But this just for the example, and I will show you what I have in mind with this. Then the one with the one flashlight as said in the introduction, and then we have the same situation here but with a flashlight from the button, as I have explained this as well. So this shadow here is now a little bit brighter here, and everything else has more light as well. So the more flashlights you use, maybe you have an eye on the overall exposures, because it can be blown out very fast here. And as you can see here, we have some dark areas here. This is not taken away from the second one, but the overall light was a little bit better because this bounces here then from the flashlight back, and it's a tiny little bit better. But what happens here is, of course, as well, as you can see, we have here these reddish tint in it. This is from the surrounding area and is of course bleeding into the gray ball here. And even this looks here pretty nicely like a sky. This goes here into a reddish. So we have here a gradient. And this is something that might look good in one picture, but if it is a texture that goes into a scene that has not exactly that light setup, that's maybe not nice. So the flashlight has another option to blow out the colors from the surrounding object. That is why I have used here a gray ball, because we get here now just the white light, and when we have two flashlights here, any influence from the surrounding is nearly gone. I guess if I would have put here 4 flashlights, one here, one here, one here, and one here, of course where the camera was, then everything would be here even more even, and I wouldn't see here these dark bright areas so well. This here is maybe a spot that we have in each and every one that's not light dependent. And so you get already the idea. We have here to deal with color and light, and if the light wouldn't be so diffused, we would have to deal here maybe as well with shadow. And then with one light we have a very hot spot here in the middle, and then it goes easily to the sides to a little bit darker. With 2 flashlights we get this problem eliminated here and here, but we can see here these areas are a little bit dark, and the gray ball gives you of course a nice little reference for that. So 4 lights would be nice, 3 light would be also nice, 1 from below and 2 from the top, left and right, and then we have a nice triangle, not to confuse with a 3-point light, and this is a light source that should be equal, so no fill, no main, no kicker or something like this, no leading light. It's just to have all 3 lights in the same way, and then you get a more or less even light situation. The more light sources and the more balanced they are to each other, the better, of course, to get a shadowless image. Of course, there will be always something here or there. It's very difficult. In the moment you have everything based on the shadows, you have maybe some highlights here, some blown out areas. It becomes more and more difficult the more light sources you have. But that's not the theme here. And I will discuss, of course, these shadow casts here and maybe how to get rid of without losing the light in the next episode. So just to explain the idea of a fill light, if you have areas like this here that is just too dark to really get anything out of it, and you can see here in the background we have already everything blown out, which has here more or less some details, and even here where this is completely white, here we can see a little bit finally. Anyway, I had 2 flashlights, one from the camera and one from the side here inside of this area here, and you can see we get some light. This is brighter here than this, and the all over idea is of course a little bit more friendly. That means I push everything away from the noise floor, and if I push this here more into the brightness area, and I have certainly some details here, but I would get a lot of noise here inside, which I wouldn't have here because it's already much brighter. And so I have more details here on my hand, and this is of course not a texture, it's just to explain the same camera, the same situation a minute later or 2, and just one flashlight that goes from the top and one directly into that, not in this picture, in this one here, and we get a complete balanced shot here. Maybe not beauty for an image because it's all pretty much in the same way and we lose a little bit contrast. This looks much nicer here, of course, than this here. But for a texture, we have to have a different idea what we need. And this is, of course, one of the major things that I want to stress here more and more and more. When we go and shoot textures, the beauty or the art has to stay home because we are more than a capture technician. And to get here these reproduction of the world instead of an expression of the world, that is our target when we want to have more or less neutral textures. And this closes here this episode already, and I hope it was useful to think about light. It mustn't be flash, it can be also something that has just a cable on it and a switch and it is the whole time on. But flashlights are small and powerful. Thanks for listening, have fun with it, bye bye.